Good evening. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including Dakota land ceded and taken in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The History Department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So welcome everyone, good evening. I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the chair of the history department here at the University of Minnesota. I'm very glad that you were able to join us this evening for the History Book Club. For those of you who are attending the book club for the first time, we feature books by both our faculty and our alumni. And what we try to have is a conversation followed by some Q&A. So we will have first our author give a brief presentation about the book that we will be reviewing this evening. Then there'll be about a half an hour of conversation with a faculty member, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. As questions occur to you, you can feel free to put them in the chat. And when we get to the Q&A portion, I will read those for our guests to reply. We have standing by Clayton Smith, our history development officer and extraordinary logistics coordinator of our book club. So he'll be monitoring things. He will record the presentation so that you can visit them later or share them with friends and colleagues. And he'll step in if anything needs to be fixed. But for now, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome back PhD alumnus Paul Barclay, who is currently a professor of history at Lafayette College. And he finished his PhD just as I was arriving as a faculty member in the department. So for me, reading his book that we're featuring today, Kondo the Barbarian, a Japanese adventurer and indigenous Taiwan's bloodiest uprising, was really a fascinating read. I learned so much. I am a historian of Latin America, and I do research the very tail end of the colonial period, and I teach about the colonial period, and I just saw so many resonances, even though the time period is 20th century instead of, the 1500s or something, that the dynamics of colonialism and an interesting character like Kondo, who is a Japanese colonial settler, but also kind of a mediator, someone who marries into the indigenous groups on the island of Taiwan. And so in that sense, too, we had our land acknowledgement and recognition of tribal relations. But again, the American Indian Studies Department here and in our department really thinks about global indigeneity. And this book also fits very much into that theme of global indigeneity. We're going to be joined soon. We're just having a little bit of a technical difficulty getting our conversation partner in, and that's Hiromi Mizuno, who's a professor of Japanese history in our department here at the University of Minnesota. But while we're waiting for her to join, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Paul so that he can tell us about how he came to write this book and a little bit about the historical context of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Clayton. It's quite an honor to be invited back to my old graduate school stomping grounds. It's really was a beautiful place to study and to try to become an historian. So that's really nice to be here. I was asked to spend about 10 minutes trying to give this book a context. And for this kind of history, that will involve some maps and some chronology. It's not going to be a full-on lecture, but I'm going to share my screen so I can set this book up with some imagery and some context to hopefully make our discussion more interesting. So I believe we're having our screen share, and I put the names of my dissertation committee on here, even though, of course, I don't hold them responsible for any of errors of fact or interpretation here. The setting of this book is the Japanese Empire, or Imperial Japan. And for most Americans, this empire is the one that was conquered by the Army and the Navy after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so this is a familiar map of processes such as island hopping and battles in Micronesia, the Western Pacific, and Southeast Asia. And there's been quite a few excellent books written about this phase of Japanese imperialism. And there's still a lot more to say about this empire. But it is also true that this empire begins in 1868 with the restoration of the emperor, hence empire, as the sovereign, and that from the 1860s through the 1930s, Japan annexed, conquered, and acquired different spaces and made them part of Imperial Japan. And it's this empire that Japan was defending with its attack on Pearl Harbor and the wars fought after 1942. And so when I explain this book, it has to be put in a context of this territorial aggrandizement that begins in 1871 with the annexation of Yezo, which becomes Hokkaido. And then there's the Northern Territories. The Ryukyu Islands become Okinawa Prefecture in the late 1870s. And it's the Qing-Japanese War of 1894 and 95 that is the condition of Taiwan becoming part of the Japanese Empire. And the Russo-Japanese War produces more of these territorial gains from a Japanese perspective. The southern half of Sakhalin Island is annexed in 1905, and Korea begins to lose its sovereignty after that war as Japan establishes itself in northeast China, most infamously with the South Manchurian Railway. And then with the annexation of Korea in 1910, we have an empire that is far-flung and multicultural and extensive from a Japanese perspective. And it's Taiwan that is the first formal colonial possession. It's about 100 miles from the coast of China, but it's also 100 miles from the southernmost island group in Okinawa Prefecture. Most people in Taiwan are Han Chinese, but not everyone. And the center of this book is really dealing with that not everyone part of Taiwan. It is also not generally known that while Taiwan was a part administratively of the Qing dynasty, it was just a prefecture of Fujian province until the late 1880s and had a relatively short life as its own province because it was seized in 1895 as a result of this war with the Qing dynasty. So Taiwan in historiography is a colonial laboratory for Japan, where things that are learned there are exported to the Korean peninsula and beyond. It's a breadbasket as an exporter of rice, of bananas, of tea, and other foodstuffs. And it's also a military base, as a place for the forward projection of power into either Southeast Asia or South China or Micronesia. And so there is this integration of Taiwan into Imperial Japan along a number of vectors and lines of mutual influence there. And for people living in this empire in the home islands in the 1920s, the setting of the book, this multicultural, far-flung empire was the object of these sustained global imperial enterprises. And to echo Sarah's opening comments, if we think about global indigeneity, these projects in education and infrastructure building and counterinsurgency and assimilation campaigns that occur in Taiwan, and Kondo Katsusaburo, the protagonist of this book, he's right in the center of these processes. They're most prominent in Taiwan, in Korea, in the Japanese Empire, but Japanese migration and settlement over the decades is also part of Chinese history, the history of Micronesia, Sakhalin, and Hokkaido. And I'm glad to see Professor Mizuno here. Now I'm relaxed because I really think this is going to be a great conversation. Thank you so much, Hiromi. And so this far-flung, multi-climate, multi-ethnic empire attracts a lot of Japanese interest in ethnography, cultural tourism, but also counterinsurgency. So the whole kind of panoply of contradictory policies towards indigenous peoples occurs in Taiwan as it does globally. And Kondo the Barbarian, which is his self sort of described moniker, that's the name that he gives himself. His story, the one I'm telling in this book, sort of traces these long-term processes through his life because he was resident in Taiwan throughout his adult life. So topography is important to this book, and it's important to the history of Taiwan, and it's important to the colonization of Taiwan. And basically the idea for Japanese colonizers is that Taiwan has two parts: the plains, where we find cities and we find wet rice agriculture and dense populations, by and large, descendants of migrants from Fujian and Guangdong province, and then the mountains, which is the abode of descendants of Austronesian peoples who predate Han inhabitation of Taiwan by many centuries. And so from an outsider's point of view, this bifurcation of Taiwan into plains and mountains in the late 19th century, it is presented as the mountainous territory is the eastern half of Taiwan, and it's an externality. It's an externality to governance and to things that we might frame as civilization or citizenship or even subjecthood. But as the Japanese government ensconces itself on the island, that mountainous territory begins to be presented as a void, something to be overcome and enfolded into Japanese sovereignty, no longer an externality. And by the 19-teens, the representation of the inner part of Taiwan it's a specially administered district, an ethnic enclave that is basically defined by its non-Chineseness, but also by various other lacks of things that make it governable in what people consider a normal sense, but also as a place that would be ethnologically of great interest. And it's this place in between the mountains and the plains that takes the name, the savage border, in Japanese discourse and in Qing discourse. And Kondo's name, Seiban Kondo, it takes that, he takes his name from this area between the mountains and the plains. And this is where he spends his life. Kondo Katsusaburo, who was born in 1873 and probably died in the mid-1940s, is a known historical figure in Japanese documents, but he's a bit shadowy and difficult to track. It is a historical fact that he was an accomplished mountaineer and tracker. He had a facility with languages, and he was an interpreter, and there is a record of him, but he was very very low in the administrative pecking order. So his documentation is scarce and scattered. More important to Japanese colonial rule was his common law wife, a person named Iwan Robao. And there's actually more documentation about her than about Kondo, but I could not write a book about her because she did not leave a memoir. But it's Iwan's exploits as a person who was in the employ of the government general that makes Kondo's story even possible. So these two are the center of a story. And in the book, it took me a lot of effort to reconstruct the geography. And so if we go to the center of Taiwan, and I'll just briefly touch upon it here, Puli is in the geographic center of Taiwan in a basin, and Ugonglun is a fenced residence that's within walking distance of Puli, but it's not a walled city, and it is an interzone between Puli and areas very high up in the mountains like Palan, which is the residence of Tagadaya people. And so if we look at this on a more carefully constructed map that we can use with aerial photography, we can see that Kondo begins in the walled city as a Japanese migrant working his way up a colonial ladder. He doesn't get very far. Then he becomes a resident of Ugonlun, which is also where Iwan is a resident, and she's from Palan, higher up in the mountains. So there is a geography to this story that when if you do decide to look at the book, it is a detailed geography, because without that, we can't understand the story. And this story takes place in the thickly forested interzone between highland and lowland, where Japan fought resource wars to fund its colony. And so between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Kondo participated in these resource wars, which provided the seed money for a government general of Taiwan to fund its infrastructure in sugar production, railway transportation, and deep harbor construction. So this is an important period, and Kondo's story is in part a story of these resource wars. Kondo's sort of place on the world stage is to help the Japanese government get mountain guns placed at strategic points in a time before there was aerial combat. So it took a lot of negotiation and savvy and duplicity, to be honest, to move these guns to strategic points. There's also double crossing and ways of turning local peoples against each others by establishing kind of monopolies on certain kinds of guns, ammunition, gunpowder, salt, and metal goods that are leveraged into creating situations where local peoples will fight other peoples for the Japanese government. And there's the building of fences, many of them electrified and armed, and Kondo is part of this process. And then Kondo's job is to get indigenous peoples to work for the Japanese police and army to haul material, water, weaponry, and the other things that are needed for warfare in places where pack animals, horses, and combustion engines cannot reach. All of this material is carried by foot. And so this becomes a rather intensive war in the early 19 teens, which leads to a situation where Japan has a very light footprint in the mountains of Taiwan circa 1900, but by 1930, they're building a lot of infrastructure, and indigenous peoples are the ones who are paying the costs of this version of modernization. This explodes into an uprising on October 27th, 1930. And on the first day of this uprising, 134 Japanese men, women, and children are killed. And this is a security breach. It's a scandal for the government. And in the wake of this scandal, in this bout of violence, people have to resign from office, and there are many, many official investigations into this. And Kondo's memoir, the basis of this book, comes out of this proliferation of reflection papers, investigative journalism, and even smear campaigns against the government by the opposition party. And so his memoir is published in late 1930 and early 1931. He becomes a minor celebrity very briefly, and that provides the context and the occasion for this book. I hope I haven't sort of overdone it here with the introduction, but I thank you for your attention to that. That is a monologue more than a discussion, but I wanted to set up the book.
Oops. There, I was trying to find my unmute button. Thank you very much, Paul, for that great introduction to the book, and especially the context in which it takes place. And now I'm very happy to welcome Professor Hiromi Mizuno, who's a historian of Japan in our department here, and has some questions that she's going to ask Paul about this really fascinating study.
Thank you. And Paul, well, thank you for letting me be the interviewer. That's really exciting. And then I really love this book. If you have not had a chance to read it, it's really beautiful book. I had a list of questions that I prepared, but first of all, for those people who are not familiar, would you like to explain the Musha incident just a tiny bit more? Because that's the highlight of the story too.
So the Musha incident is the most famous sort of violent encounter between Taiwanese and the Japanese colonial state. And it begins with this dawn attack on a Japanese sports day, which, if you know anything about Japanese school life, Undokai is a big day. It's a sports day. And when the Japanese government was caught unawares, it took them a while to mobilize troops against the insurgents. And it was a 50-day war. And so the 50-day war resulted in the deaths of about 1,000 Taiwan indigenous peoples, and this occurs in stages. There's just killings by aerial bombardment and gunfire, but there's also people who are sort of starved into submission. There's forced relocation. There's a concentration camp built for people that fought against Japan. And then this encounter leaves a very large footprint on the framing of Japanese colonial rule in Taiwan, because it becomes the subject of a blockbuster movie called Warriors of the Rainbow that came out in Taiwan. And so it is, I guess, on the world stage, it's one of many incidents in colonial history where there's violence and suppression. But then I think in the media landscape, it's a very outsized incident. And then as an historian, the thing that's so important about the Musha Rebellion is that it produces so much documentation, because the state is trying to grapple with why it happened, and there's so much more information about indigenous peoples that comes out of these inquiries than we might otherwise have. So that's my sort of nutshell explanation of that incident.
Thank you. And so I'm gonna explain just a little bit about the book structure, and then I'll have a question about each part. But the book itself, consists of the introduction written by Paul that introduces the Japanese colonial rule of Taiwan, and then Musha incident. But then the middle 1/3 is the his translation of the Kondo's writings that was published in this Taiwan Nichi Nichi Shimbun, which is a newspaper in Taiwan, in Japanese. And then the other 1/3, he has notes. So I'll have a question about that part later on. But let me first ask, and I'm actually dying to know this, because the Kondo the Barbarian, the Kondo himself sounds like kind of, I don't know, it sounds like a really crazy guy too. He's like really adventurous. He's doing so many different things. When you read his writings, you don't really know how much of it is like he's just boasting off, like exaggerating his achievements, etc., etc. It's a beautiful, beautiful translation. But how did you even come across him and this publication? You've done a lot of research on colonial Taiwan. So at one point, did you encounter this figure and this specific writings that you translated, and what made you want to have an independent book out of this?
Well, thank you for that bracing endorsement of the book, which they haven't run out of them. It's still available. That's an understatement. So I came across this memoir in the bibliography of a Japanese language journalistic account of the rebellion in about maybe 2005 or 6. I was on sabbatical, and so I went to the microfilm room at Keio University. They had a subscription to this colonial newspaper, and remember when you used to order the roll of microfilm and then you would like look through it, and so I printed them all out, and they didn't have the last issue. It was burned, the microfilm company. It was blurry, so I had to go to Tokyo University and find a paper copy, and I didn't have my camera, so I had to copy it by hand to get it, because that was the best episode. So then I had all of this kind of material, and I had already been working on this area, but it was such a good story, I thought. So I transcribed and made notes to it and published the whole thing in Japanese in 2008 in a specialist journal that's published in Japan called Studies of Taiwan Indigenous Peoples. And they helped me. They're great editors and they're experts. And it sat for a while after I transcribed it into Japanese and wrote an introduction to it in Japanese. But in between 2008 and right now, the Japanese colonial archive was digitized in Taiwan and made available online. And so I was actually able to go back and find all kinds of handwritten documents, and many of them that confirm many parts of this story and expand it and turn it into other lines of inquiry, but then also to see where he was making things up, which for me, that's where the historian comes in, right? It's not a literary book where I just translate it and say, well, everybody makes everything up and here's another one. Like, it's not that kind of book. I'm going to say this is right and this is wrong, which is a little conservative in a sense, but that's kind of exciting to me that the archive, it's been made available. It's still kind of hard to read because you have to know the geography. But then to answer your question, the first book that I wrote on all of this information, which is called Outcasts of Empire, I can't assign that to my students because it's not really for them. And so I wanted to write a book that undergraduates could read. And I think that this has a narrative and it might be sort of like Musui's story, or the prison memoirs of a Japanese woman, or Orphan of Asia, or Lost Names. We have all of these translated books that are narratives, and they have a personal perspective, and at least my students seem to gravitate towards the concrete and something written at that level. And I'd hoped that this book might facilitate people being interested in Taiwan that way.
Mhm, mhm. Indeed, and I must say, I was one of the lucky people who was asked by Paul to write a book cover endorsement. So the reason why I was lucky is because, of course, I'm honored to do that. But also, I got to read the book before the publication, and that was a real joy. So I definitely am endorsing it officially and unofficially. But there are many really great features of this book. And again, I have many questions about that. But one thing about the book is that the highlight of the story is that October 1930 Musha rebellion. Yet there is another incident that kind of pulls the entire story, the Kondo story, but also your scholarly writing around it, which is the disappearance of the Fukahori mission in 1897. And that was an official mission, right, sent by the government for map making immediately after the Taiwan then became Japan's colony after the Sino-Japanese War. So therefore, and that disappearance of Fukahori, the leader of the mission, seems to have inspired the Kondo to actually live there and do all sorts of things so that he could find what happened to the mission. So the book and the Kondo story itself actually covers like 4 decades, all the way from the beginning of the Japanese colonial rule of Taiwan to the 1930s. So this makes the book extremely useful for the classroom use, as well as anybody who is interested in not just the Musha incident or the colonialist perspective, but just the colonial rule overall. And your introduction, I think, really is well written to learn that. So coming from there, you are a historian of modern Japan, but then you are the expert. We all always say the expert of colonial Taiwan. So what got you interested in the Taiwan part among the Japanese Empire or Japanese history? And for the audience, what would you say how would you explain why we should learn the colonial Taiwan if we are interested in modern Japanese history or in a larger global history? Meaning, like, why would we read this book? Of course, I have many reasons that I can say, but from your perspective.
Well, I started, so I think that the way you've put those two questions together is really helpful to me. So thank you, because I think the reason I became interested in Taiwan would hopefully be the same reason people who are not interested in Taiwan might become interested in Taiwan, is that I was writing an undergraduate thesis at the University of Wisconsin under the direction of Alfred McCoy, who works on the Philippine Islands. And this was in the early 90s, and Edward Said's book was still very influential at that time. And I was looking at colonial ethnography in the Philippines. And as I studied the American colonial management of Philippine Highlands, I noticed that American administrators were corresponding with Japanese administrators about how they were doing things in Taiwan. And once I started to look at that other story in Taiwan, I realized it was much bigger than the story in the Philippines because, from an American perspective, Luzon is a world away, and it's not really integral to American history the way Taiwan was to Japan at the time. So just in terms of the amount of documentation and what could be learned and what can be learned there. And so I changed from US history to Japanese history in graduate school to follow up this comparative research. And then the American side of the story kind of fell out. And then once you visit Taiwan to do research, and I had, been to Japan and tried hard to learn Japanese, and, the verdict's still out on that. I mean, I've been given it a good try. But once you go to Taiwan to do research, most people are hooked. And the reason is that if you're studying the history of Taiwan, you can go back to the 17th century and up to the 21st century, and every important thing that's happened in global history, Taiwan's right in the middle of it. Whether it's maritime exploration, it can have to do with the movement of animals and crops. And in my case, it is a chapter in the global indigeneity. What do colonial states do with people who lived adjacent to early modern empires? How do they become enfolded into state spaces and in such an awkward and incomplete way that they're neither sovereign nor really having the benefits of modernity that we think of. So this whole thing is central to Taiwanese history through the lens of Japanese imperialism. And I think that anybody that's interested in that global process of the sort of stitching together of incommensurate life worlds under administrative umbrellas, and all the people that make that happen with sort of the ambiguous roles of people like Kondo, who on the one hand, he's really an imperialist and he's proud of it. On the other hand, he's so reluctant, and he's criticizing the Japanese state for all of their failures, and they're ones that we wouldn't think of to criticize them with. He's got his own worldview, and I think it's helpful, at least historians like to do this, to every once in a while read something very granular that we don't really know how to categorize it. I don't know what to do with him exactly. And so I think reading what he has to say with supervision, you need the notes because he does make some things up. I think there's a lot that we could learn about the making of the world that we live in by thinking about him and people like him and what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing. So that's what I would say in response to your questions.
Excellent. Can I ask just one more question? Okay, great. Because I'm looking at the clock, I have to choose one question out of many. So, as I said, the translation is 1/3 of the book, and the other 2/3 is like your introduction and then the notes. And then these notes is wonderful because that is where your fact-checking investigative research really is laid out. And it's really well researched with, you went through the newspapers of the time, Japanese military records, government documents, and as also the secondary materials that are listed out there that you cross-checked, etc. So it's super useful for historians too. The translation part is just so beautifully done. So then I want to ask about the authorship. because the book is under your name in the publication, but there's the Kondo as the actual writer of the story that you translated. But then, as you also said in your introduction in the book, it took Pira Pihu, who told the story as the eyewitness of the Musha incident, because Kondo was not right there. And then what I also find fascinating is the Taiwan newspaper that decided to publish his story. So you mentioned the editor's name there too. There are different kinds of the authors in a way. So, you know, this is a history book club. So I wanted to you to share your thoughts on these multiple kind of a really complex the sense of authorship.
Well, so I've looked at books that I've liked, like Musui's story or the Prison Memoirs of a Japanese Woman, the book about Kaneko Fumiko, and I've wondered about those books because they're sort of English versions of Japanese modern translations of older documents. So in Japan, a scholar will recover a diary or some kind of primary source and then write it in more vernacular modern Japanese and put a timeline at the end of it and do a treatment. And then after that, somebody in the United States will take that treatment and put it into English, and then they won't call themselves an author. They'll say that Kaneko Fumiko wrote it, or that this guy named Musui wrote it. And that actually doesn't make sense to me. That is not the way forward. My book's different. I stitched together a bunch of microfilm and spent 15 years trying to figure out, you know, why it was interesting. And then, as you said, the newspaper editor who knew better, the people at that newspaper knew that Kondo's chronology was weird, because the Taiwan Nichi Shimpo was the best archive on Taiwan, and it got bombed by the US government, and it's gone now. But so who is the author of the book? There are a lot of voices there. A lot of them are hard to figure out who said it exactly, who wrote it down, and whose voice is being articulated. So I think that, you know, I put myself as the author of this book as a way to kind of take responsibility for how much artifice goes into this. I wouldn't even pretend that this is straight out of Kondo's mouth. And I'm not trying to express sort of condemning people that actually say that Musui's story was written by this person when it wasn't. But I think that your question is interesting, and I haven't been able to peel back all of the layers of it like that. But I will mercifully end this long answer by saying is that I didn't think I should publish this narrative without fact checking it, because Kondo seems to think that this was a non-violent kind of conquest, and that it was sort of a comedy of errors. There's a lot of kind of Keystone Cops going on, and that's just not the case. So thank you for those questions. I can tell you really studied up. Thank you.
If I could just add, there is, of course, for those of you who may not be familiar, there is the perception that the Japanese rule of Taiwan was a lot more peaceful and then met less resistance than that over Korea, for example. But if you read this book, then you will encounter a series of conflicts and resistance and violence, and it really makes you think on the ground what really went on under the facade or the presumption of the I guess peaceful, as Kondo would have put it, more peaceful rule. So I think it's I highly recommend the book. It's really readable. The translation is just beautiful. But I'll stop my questions here so that the audience can ask questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul and Hiromi, for such an interesting conversation so far. And indeed, we do have questions already in the chat, and I invite others to put some questions in there if you would like. Rachel Martin starts us off first by saying very fascinating, and bringing up a question that I know from reading the book is quite central to your study. She says she's curious about the intercultural facets of Kondo's marriage. Were there any policies for or against marrying into the indigenous community? And also those heads, so it's a two-part question. So the marriage, and then you had a photo briefly up with people holding heads. What was that about? Was it instigated by the Japanese?
Well, thanks for that question, Rachel, who was my classmate at the University of Minnesota. So this is, I don't know, there's like an incredible amount of like warmth that is permeating me right now that exceeds literary bounds. So the early instances of Japanese male indigenous female intermarriage in the Taiwan colonial context is a holdover from Qing period times. The women that married Japanese sub-officials and traders and policemen were an occupational group. They lived in towns like Ugonglun, and they were the daughters of politically powerful men in the interior of Taiwan. And this was an established mechanism for having commercial and diplomatic relationships between communities that had no face-to-face contact. It was a way for people in the interior to keep flatlanders at arm's length, and it was a way for flatlanders to communicate and obtain trade goods. So that's kind of phase one, is a long history. And of course, the value add, to put it in neoliberal language that I get from working at Lafayette, I should say the genius of the women that worked in this space was their linguistic facility. And Kondo was the unusual kind of Japanese man that actually, that linguistic facility, he also acquired it. So, but then if we just fast forward into 1907 and 1908, when the Japanese policy to take resources becomes more urgent, the Japanese government general recommends that Japanese policemen seek indigenous common law wives to facilitate conquest. And those go poorly because there is a misalignment. The Japanese policeman wants to create a subordinate relationship, and the indigenous peoples want to create an alliance. And so the difference between kind of an administrative hierarchy and situational ethics of alliance building kind of blow up there. The decapitations are from 1903, and that is certainly something that the Japanese state encouraged and underwrote and celebrated. So thank you, Rachel. It's good to see you again.
Yes, thanks. And indeed, in Kondo's story himself, I think he has 3 wives. Is that right, Paul, over the course of the narrative? And that there's controversy about this sort of, you abandon one wife to make a new alliance into a new group. And then the Japanese government says, well, we need an inroad into this group. And so now you got to marry into that. So you see it threaded throughout the account that is in the newspaper from Kondo. Abraham also, Seda, who's also an alum of our program and a colleague of yours there at Lafayette, you I think already started to answer his question when you were talking about who you had written the book for, in a sense that your undergraduate students aren't going to read the monograph that you've written about colonial Taiwan, but they can read this. And I wonder if you want to just expand on that and sort of talk about the experience of teaching the book and how has that gone, and sort of what is the students' response to Kondo's story.
Well, thank you, Abraham. It's good to see you. I just saw you earlier today when we were sort of recovering from being among them. And you know, those people that we teach have responded well to the book so far, at least the ones, you know how it is. I mean, the people that bring it up and talk about it with you, the book seems to work. And then there's people I haven't checked in with. I'll know more maybe when I examine them via Blue Book, but I think it works so far. In that it's, I think people like personal stories. I think the jury's still out on that.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, they're welcome to put it in the chat. Otherwise, I can also return to Hiromi, who I know had quite a list of questions that she didn't get to all of them. Would you like to pose another question while we wait to see if there's some more from the audience? Hiromi?
Sure, I have a few, but let me just strike one first. What were the surprises when you were doing this research and writing?
I was actually,
Anything that didn't get into the book that we can now hear from you?
well, okay, so the things that don't get into this book that need to be there is that there was chain migration from Tokushima Prefecture, where Kondo is from, to the Hualien region of Taiwan. And I think this story about the way empires are built is that they're regional. The people that leave one place are regional, and they go to other regions, and they're connected together. They're not individuals. It's not just somebody from Japan going to Taiwan. There are people in Tokushima that go to Hualien and that area, and they build colonies like Yoshino. And Yoshino is the name of a river in Tokushima. So, you know, if you're in the United States, you see places called New London and New York, and they're new. Well, that was done in Taiwan. And so I think the story that I learned about Kondo's family in Tokushima from reading his kokuseki, or his koseki, not his kokuseki, but his koseki, his family register, I was able to learn some things about his younger brother, who also went to Taiwan, but also about his household back in Japan. His sisters had children out of wedlock, and he was trying to figure out how to take care of them. And, you know, the politics of sort of sustaining oneself or reproducing oneself socially while working in a part of the empire as a low-level functionary. You know, this turns into its own subplot that was a little bit astray of this book, but I think it'd be a good study. And I was really surprised that all those Japanese people that picked up the thread of his story didn't kind of call him out on things that he got wrong. That was kind of a big surprise to me.
So it really reveals, and I really appreciate the book for various reasons, but the empire's composition, or the actual like function of the empire, it's not just the leaders or military going there. There's all this thick layer of I guess the lower in the pecking order, as you say, I mean, those people who actually kind of make it function on a daily and a ground level basis, and we don't know about them that much, so it's like Kondo. There are tons of many others like this, right? So that's really, really fascinating. One final question from me is the translation part, because your translation is beautiful, yet at the same time in introduction you said parts are abridged by you. In the notes section you have a discussion about the English word Aborigines, indigenous people that you use to translate the Japanese terms. I just assume that there were a lot of issues and questions that you had to deal with. If you could share anything, that would be great.
So first and foremost, I did not use the word savage in my translation. So many authors in Japan, especially, but also in Taiwan and even in North America, they say, well, that's the word people used at the time, so I have to use it. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best uses of terminology to refer to people the way they would have been referred to at the time in a way that would have made sense. And so there's this kind of nested hierarchy of terms, right? You could say an indigenous person, you could say a northern tribe's indigenous person, you could say a Sedic person, or somebody could be Tagadaya, Toda, or they could be Atayal, or they could be somebody who's Amis, but they could be a subgroup. And the hardest part of this translation was the geography. I had to get these big, large form atlases that were produced by the Taiwan central government in conjunction with the Bureau of Indigenous Affairs that came out in 2014. And there was this massive government project to produce these large format maps of the indigenous territory based on, Japanese forestry and rural administration. And so as I reconstructed the geography, then trying to reconstruct the kind of ethnic map, because ethnicity is complicated. It's situational. Like some days you feel like an American, some days you feel like a Minnesotan, some days you're a Golden Gopher, or however that might work. Go Gophers. And so luckily there's been some really good work on Taiwan indigenous peoples written by translation scholar Daryl Sturck. And Daryl helped me with this. So the translation, the hardest part was getting the geography right and trying to think of a better word than savage. Because if you go to Taiwan a lot and you start meeting the descendants of the people in the book, it really hurts you to use the word savage. It's just terrible. So, excuse me, that was just a cough. I wasn't getting choked up about the word savage, but I don't like using it. So some people have pushed back on that and say, well, are you trying to clean this up? Or are you trying to be, I don't know, there's all kinds of pejorative words for people that are trying to be less horrible than our ancestors. And I've been called some of those, but I think that those are some of the challenges of translation, right? To be faithful to the documents, but why produce casual harm when it's not necessary? And the other problem with the word savage is it's so imprecise. Who are they talking about? Like if I just substitute the word savage every time Kondo used it in the original text, you don't know who he's talking about. And so that's a big caveat. And I put all of that in the book. So I'm not like, I didn't like sneak that in. I came clean on that.
Well, thank you, Paul. And of course, as often happens in book club, the questions are now flowing in. I'm going to invite those who are putting in some questions now that we're going to close out the sort of official recorded portion, but you're welcome to stay on for a few minutes. And if Paul has some time, he can continue to address some of your questions. But for now, since we've reached the 7 o'clock hour, I want to really thank Paul and Hiromi for a fascinating discussion. Thank all of you who have come this evening to participate. You'll be sent a copy of the recording in coming up, and I think you'll get an invitation by email as well. The book club is going to be on vacation in December, but in January, we've rescheduled the event that we originally planned for October that had to be canceled. And that is, we're going to have a visiting professor from Ukraine in the history department, Oleksandr Komarenko. And it's not strictly about one book that he's published, but to have a chance to have a conversation with him about the current situation in Ukraine in historical perspective. What is the history of relations between Ukraine and Russia? So that will be January 17, and you should receive an invitation for that. Oh, Clayton already has gotten it in. That's great. We just firmed up the date, but Clayton has put, you can also click on now to register for that one. And I think Clayton will also put a link to these books that come out of our alumni and our faculty. A lot of this is because of graduate fellowships that allow our students to write their dissertations and turn them into great books. And if you're so moved, we certainly invite you to make a gift towards those fellowships. So with that, I thank Paul and Hiromi and all of you again. We'll close out the official book club. But as I said, you're welcome to stay on, and we'll be able to ask a few more questions if we can impose upon Paul for a little bit more time. Thank you, and good evening, everyone.